and welcome to Jason's Macintosh Museum. I'm Jason, your host, and today we're looking at a Power Macintosh 7220 from 1997. Now, the reason I've chosen the Power Macintosh 7220 for today's video is that I find that out of all of the Power Macintosh desktop models that Apple produced from 1994 all the way through until the very late 1990s, I find that this particular model it stands out because it's very unusual, both in terms of the way it was designed and the way it was built. So let me explain. The 7220 came out during a time when Apple were licensing other manufacturers to produce Macintosh clones, official Macintosh clones. And those companies, for example, were companies along the lines of Motorola, Power Computing, and UMax. And so those companies were producing their own hardware and licensing the Macintosh OS from Apple, at least I believe that's how the deal was being done. And it was being done simply because Apple they wanted to increase their market share, basically. And certainly one of the lessons that was learned from the Microsoft Intel PC was that if you have many different manufacturers producing compatible hardware, then you can often sell far more copies of your operating system and you get a much wider installed base of your operating system. So that's what Apple did, but it didn't last very long. I think the clones only lasted for a couple of years in the mid to late 1990s before Apple pulled the plug on that operation. And so you had machines from these other companies that were coming in at a much lower price point than what Apple were offering, and yet those machines, even though they didn't look like a Macintosh, they may not have been as well made as a proper Apple Macintosh, they did their job very well. They were relatively cheap and they ran the Macintosh OS, so it was completely compatible with all Macintosh software, and so they probably did, I believe, take a sizable chunk out of Apple's market share at the time. But when this was all going on, Apple themselves thought, well, we need to develop our own machine that will compete head-on with these clones. So what they had to do was they had to come up with a machine that could be built for basically as low a price as possible. And that meant using as many off-the-shelf industry standard parts as they could use. Now, we've seen this all before with Apple, mainly in the area of disk drives, because if you remember, all Macintosh models up until the mid-1990s used SCSI exclusively as their hard disk interface. But by the mid-1990s, Apple found that IDE or ATA drives were a lot cheaper in terms of the capacity you could get for the amount of money you paid. And so they started transitioning over to ATA drives. And that was really the start of their push to use more industry standard components. But with the Power Macintosh 7220, they went all out to use industry standard components. And I'm talking about everything: the case, the drives, the motherboard, the power supply. Everything was basically off-the-shelf industry standard parts. Now, that did mean that the machine was a lot cheaper to build, but it also meant that when you compare it to other Power Macintosh models that were available at the time, the 7220 looks basically, it is what it is. It's very cheap and a bit nasty in terms of its construction and design, and we'll see that as we have a closer look. But having said that, the machine did fulfill its intended purpose quite well. It did compete head-on with all the clones, and I think there were some people who, even though the clones would still run Macintosh software, they were still probably biased towards a proper Apple Power Macintosh. And in fact, having a look at the 7220, you can already see how different it is in terms of its design to other Power Macintosh models. For example, one glaringly obvious point is the location of the floppy drive. It's on the left. This was the only desktop Macintosh that I know of ever made where its floppy drive was on the left, because Apple had always put the floppy drive on the right-hand side of the case, but not here. And in addition to that, as we look inside, you'll see that the case, it's not just a metal outer casing, the entire case is metal, even the internals of it, which admittedly was a bit like the original 2VX, 2VI and Quadra 650 models that also had a metal case. The difference was that the metal case used in those was was quite high quality and very solid. This isn't. It's very cheaply made, it's very thin metal. It's basically the same case you would find in any number of Intel machines built at around the same time period. And so, all in all, quite an unusual machine, only because it's such a radical departure from other models that Apple was selling at the time. And one other point to note about this particular model of Macintosh, which again sets it apart from other models, is that it was the only model of Macintosh, as far as I know, that actually had two different model numbers depending on where in the world the unit was sold. In most of the world, this model was actually sold as the Power Macintosh 4400. However, in Asia and Australia, it was sold as the Power Macintosh 7220. The reason being that in Asian cultures, the number 4 is considered unlucky, so Apple decided to give it a different model number. And if I remember correctly, this is also the only 4000 series Power Macintosh model ever produced, because normally with the Power Macintosh series you had the 5000 series, the all-in-one machines, you had the 6000 series, which was the pizza box desktop style machines, and then you had the 7000 series, which was the slightly larger desktop case model. Then you had the 8000 and 9000 series, but there was only one machine where the model number started with a 4. And that was it. This was it. Of course, this one's a 7220, but of course, most areas it was the 4400. And the Power Macintosh 7220 also has the dubious honour of being one of the only, I believe, the only Power Macintosh model to use a motherboard that was not designed by Apple. Again, in Apple's push to use as many off-the-shelf components as they could, they actually used a type of motherboard known as the Tanzania motherboard, which was actually developed for use in the Macintosh clones, such as the Motorola series, the UMax and Power Computing models. So Apple actually used that motherboard, made some small changes to it, and installed it in the 7220. So you could say that there's almost nothing in this machine that is Apple's own work, whether it's the motherboard, the power supply, the case, the drives, it's all off the shelf. And admittedly, using a modified clone motherboard did present some issues in terms of the machine's functionality and expansion. For a start, other Macintosh or other Power Macintosh models available around this time, such as the 7000 series, most of them had CPU cards, so that if you had a Power Macintosh, say 7500 model, with say a 100 or 132 megahertz CPU, you could simply pull out the CPU card, install a faster one. It also made upgrading the CPU from a third-party perspective very easy, because you could go and buy a G3 upgrade for, say, a 7500 machine off the shelf. It was just a simple card, and you put it in. But with the 7220, the CPU was on the motherboard. There was no slot or daughter card for the CPU. So it was very difficult to upgrade the CPU on this model, although thankfully there were a few third-party companies who made CPU upgrades that actually plugged into the cache slot on these. So they got around the problem that way. And the other issue with this the motherboard used in this machine is to do with its memory. For some reason, the Power Macintosh 7220 uses EDO DRAM, which in itself is nothing unusual, but it uses EDO DIMM modules rather than SIM modules, which are not that common. And to make matters worse, basically all other Power Macintosh models that were around at the time that used EDO memory in DIMM format used 5-volt EDO DIMM modules, which were relatively common. But this model used 3.3 volt EDO DIMM modules, which were much harder to find. And certainly back in its day, it was expensive to upgrade the memory on this, and nowadays it's very, very hard to find any compatible modules for this particular model. So that was another downside. And it's worth noting that the Power Macintosh 7220 was available in 3 distinct models. The initial model that first came out in November of 1996 was the 7220 or 4400/160, which had a 160 MHz PowerPC 603E CPU. Then in February of 1997, Apple launched a speed bump version, if you will, with a 200 MHz 603E CPU, which is what we have here. But then a couple of months after that, in April of 1997, Apple launched a DOS-compatible version of this machine. And the DOS-compatible version had its own internal CPU card, very much like the Power Macintosh 6100 did. But in this model, the DOS compatibility card was actually a PCI card, because this is a PCI Power Mac, which had a Cyrix 166 MHz CPU on it, and that, I believe, allowed you to run Windows 95 quite comfortably. Now, it turns out I actually do have the DOS compatibility version of this model, but unfortunately, even though it has the compatibility card in it, I don't have the cable that links it to a monitor. So once I have that, I'll be able to demonstrate it. But for the time being, we'll be looking at the non-DOS compatibility version. So the specifications of the Power Macintosh 7220/200. It was launched in February of 1997 and discontinued in February of 1998. It has a 200 MHz PowerPC 603E CPU, 32 megabytes of onboard memory, expandable up to 160 megabytes, using 3 DIMM slots. But of course, those slots must use 5 volt unbuffered EDO memory. The system came with a 2 gigabyte IDE hard disk and an 8-speed CD-ROM as standard. And strange enough, the specifications that I have show that this particular model had onboard Ethernet, but this machine actually doesn't. So I'm not sure what's going on there. But of course, you could always add a PCI card, because you got 3 internal full-length, I believe, actually 2 were full-length, one was half-length, I believe, PCI slots for expansion, but we'll have a closer look at that in a moment. So that's really all there is to say about the Power Macintosh 7220. So now let's have a closer look at it. Okay, here is the front view of the Power Macintosh 7220, and as you can see, very different in terms of appearance from other Power Macintosh models. Having the floppy drive on the left-hand side of the case for a start is a bit of a giveaway. And looking at the case itself, you can see that it's a very generic-looking case, but that's because it is just that. It's a generic PC case that Apple chose to use. It's almost as though someone at Apple said, right, build us a Power Macintosh, but use everything, use all the parts off the shelf. Don't develop any parts yourself. Use whatever is out there. And that's exactly what they did. So looking at the front, we have the floppy drive on the left-hand side of the case. And as usual with machines of this age, it has the manual inject 1.4 megabyte SuperDrive and the PowerPC logo there. So down here we have the Apple badge and tag. And over here we have the built-in 8-speed IDE CD-ROM and the power button and power LED over here. And I believe the grill down here is, I believe it's for the built-in speaker, if I remember correctly. So that's the front view. There's nothing at all to see on the side, so we'll flip it over and we'll have a look at the back. Okay, well, here is the rear view of the Power Macintosh 7220, and I think this is where you really get the feeling that this is simply a Power Macintosh thrown together from all sorts of off-the-shelf parts. Just looking at the rear of it, you can see that it's a very generic looking system. So starting from the left, we've got the power supply, which is a standard ATX PC power supply. And it's got manual voltage selector there. Below that we have the information tag, which has been, well, carelessly just stuck onto the back. So assembled in Singapore at model number M3959. All the various certifications there. Then across from that, well, there's an afterthought, isn't it? Most Power Macintosh, well, in fact all Power Macintosh models that I know of that had SCSI, had the SCSI port on the motherboard, but not this one. Because the Tanzania motherboard doesn't have an onboard SCSI port mounted on the board, they've simply had to use a ribbon cable to link it to jumper pins on the motherboard. So they've actually slapped the SCSI port up there, which looks like a bit of an afterthought. And if we go down from there, we can see the ports that are actually on the motherboard. One ADB, printer and modem ports, microphone in, speaker out, and video out. And that's it. Notice there is no Ethernet port, which for a machine built circa 1997 is quite unusual. And up the top here we have the actual production information tag, manufactured April of 1997. And below that we have the 3 blanking plates for the PCI expansion slots. And that's about it. So as you can see, basically very much a clone system, you could say. Right, well, that's the external view of the Power Macintosh 7220. So now we will take it apart. Now, compared to other Power Macintosh models that were around at the time, such as the 7500 series that had a desktop case like this, taking a 7220 apart is very different, because taking this apart is very much like taking apart a DOS or Windows PC, because it was built in exactly the same manner out of the same components. So what we have to do to start with is to take off the top cover. Now, to do that, there are 3 thumb screws on the back, here, here and here. So we'll just take them out. Yep, lost that one. Notice they're not captive either, so more cost cutting there. We'll just put them aside. And now you can slide the top cover back, just like an old-fashioned PC, and lift it up to reveal the internals. Okay, so what we've got here, we've got the standard ATX power supply here, CD-ROM here, hard drive sitting over here on its side, floppy drive here, motherboard and expansion slot riser card over here. So the next thing we'll do is we'll take out the hard disk. So to do that, we simply pull up on this bracket to release it, and then we unplug the data and power, and that's the hard disk out of the system. Now the next step is to take out this crossbar that runs from the front of the case to the back. Now, if I remember, you have to, I believe you simply pull back on, in fact, it actually says back on here, I think. So I think if we lift up on the back and pull it backwards, there we go, that's the crossbar removed. What we can now do is pull out the PCI riser card, just grab it and carefully rock it out, there we go. And actually I was wrong there. It looks like we have 2 PCI slots and one looks like a Comm Slot on there. So, okay, now, next, let's see, I think we'll take out now the floppy drive and CD-ROM are on a bracket which you have to remove. Now, to do that, I believe you simply have to pull back on the bracket. So, as you can see, if you just carefully slide it, it's now loose. We'll unplug the floppy drive data cable and the power and data from the CD-ROM, which is incidentally also IDE, just like the hard disk. I should be able to then lift the entire bracket out. So that's the bracket holding the CD-ROM drive and floppy drive. Again, very cheap thin metal there. Now we can probably take out the power supply. So we'll just unplug these other cables, get them out of the way. And there's the data ID cables, we'll unplug them too. And so I think now we can actually, oh, it's not an ATX power supply. No, it's actually an AT power supply. But it looks like it's been slightly modified, because if I unplug the power supply connectors, you can see that they're the old-fashioned AT variety. But of course, AT power supplies normally don't support soft power, but this machine does. Obviously, Apple have, in fact, I think it's because there's an extra connector here, down here, for the power on signal, I would say. And, oh, hang on, we have more, well, we've got even more power, we've got even more over here. Let's unplug the SCSI, the external SCSI port ribbon cable from the board. There we go, and we can see we've got even more power. We've got 2 more power connectors to unplug. There we go, they're out. So at this point, everything is now disconnected, I believe. That's the. This looks like the CD audio cable. We'll just unplug that to get that out of the way. That's it. Now, to take the power supply out, you have to unscrew it from the back of the case, just like you would have to do on a DOS or Windows PC. So 4 screws to take out. So let me quickly take those out right now. Okay, now we've taken the screws out, we should be able to slide the power supply forwards. We should be able to slide the power supply forwards. Why can't I move the power supply forwards? What am I missing? It must be... Have I taken all the screws out? Yes, I have. Yes, so... There must be something else that this hooks into. It doesn't look like it. It actually does have hooks on the underside of the power supply that actually mate with the bracket underneath it, but I think I just have to apply enough force to move them forward. Oh, there we go. Just needs a bit of brute force. There we go. And that's the power supply out of the system. Well, by the looks of it, we will now probably take out the logic board. So to do that, let's see, we have, I don't believe there are any screws holding the motherboard down. I think it's just held in place with these little pins which hold the board in place by friction, I think. So we'll unplug the connectors. There's the speaker connector, we'll unplug there. That's the, looks like the power button and power LED connectors. That's the, it's a cooling fan connector. And, right. Now there is one plastic tab, a shot of it here, which I believe you have to push in on, and then simply pop the board up. Carefully pop the board up. It's hard to get in to release this one because you can't get your fingers underneath the board. We just have to be very, very careful. Oh, there we go. And if I now pull back on the board, that should now come straight out. And there's the board out of the system. Now what do we have left? Well, we've got the SCSI cable, the external SCSI connector there, which you would, to undo those, you'd simply unscrew these two nuts on the back. And we've got the front panel. Now to take the front panel off, it looks like there are plastic clips here, here, and one over here. So we'll just move those clips out of the way just to release them. And that's the front panel. removed. Now what do we have left? We've got the assembly for the speaker and cooling fan. So there are two little plastic tabs on the front here. Just push them in and then move the whole assembly, pivot it backwards and just wiggle it out. There we go. But notice that the cables for the power switch are still connected to this, so you can't just pull it out. You have to very carefully unhook the cables from this little tab at the bottom. Just pull it out of the way. And there we go. Just pull on that. And all that's left now is the power switch, which you have to unscrew by the looks of it. We have a screw sitting just there. So I'll quickly take that out. Okay, so that is the cooling fan, speaker and power supply or power switch assembly out, and that's about it. So that is that's the entire machine disassembled. Yep, nothing more to see. Right, so that's how you take apart a Power Macintosh 7220. So now we'll have a closer look at the components. Okay, here is the logic board out of the Power Macintosh 7220, and although at first glance it appears to be very similar to other Power Macintosh logic boards, there are some clues that this is actually not Apple's own design. And in fact, one of the clues can be found in the top left corner. The power supply connectors, which as you can see are the standard AT style connectors used by DOS or Windows machines of this time period, just before ATX became the standard. And there's another clue to the right of that. These pads for MFM floppy. Now, MFM stands for Modified Frequency Modulation, which is the recording system that DOS machines used to write to and read from floppy disks. But Macintosh models used a different encoding method called Group Code Recording, GCR. And in fact, if you look just down from the MFM connector, you see another connector which is GCR floppy. So in other words, because this motherboard was being used by other manufacturers such as Motorola and Power Computing, the board was originally designed to accept either the DOS-style MFM floppy drive or the Macintosh-style GCR floppy drive. But in this case, of course, the MFM connector was not used, and some of the circuitry that goes with it is also absent. So you've got the soft power connector there for the power supply. And moving on from there, CD audio input connector, CD-ROM connector, ATAPI, in other words, IDE CD-ROM, and the connector for the IDE hard disk. Feature option, not really sure what that is. That's where the battery would normally go. And down from there we have the 4 ROM chips. And then moving on from there, we have the 3 168-pin EDO DIMM slots. And interesting to note that 2 slots can take dual bank modules. This one can take only single bank modules, which I believe is a limitation of the board itself. And there's the CUDA chip, which handles system power, I believe, and the real-time clock. Now we've got the connector for the PCI riser card and Comm Slot riser card there. Now there would have been some kind of ROM DIMM, of course. Obviously this machine has its ROM chips soldered onto the logic board, so there's no need for a DIMM slot for the ROM. That's why it's not installed in that position. But below that we have the cache DIMM slot, which obviously could accept a level 2 cache module, but unfortunately, at least on this machine, it was not installed by default. So, as you may know, not having a level 2 cache on a PowerPC CPU certainly does impact on its performance. So it was a bit of a another cost-cutting move on Apple's part there, I believe. Let's see, we've got the power LED and fan connectors and the power switch connector there. Let's see, moving on from that, what else do we have? I've got a glue logic chip there, Lucent. I've got the ports there, so there's the ADB and serial ports there. There's the audio ports there and the video out port there. There's the audio chip, Crystal, and here is the ATI onboard graphics. So this is the, I believe it's the ATI Mach64 controller, which was also used on, I think it was used on some other Macintosh models as well, come to think of it. This one though happens to be on board. Now note the corrosion around that chip. Well, you may be asking how did that happen, because the battery on this board lives up in this corner. Well, let me explain how that happened. And basically it was entirely my own fault, because what I had done when I first acquired this machine, probably about 10 or so years ago, I found that the original PRAM battery, which is one of these, I'll just put one here for illustration, this Power Mac takes a standard 4.5 volt alkaline battery like this. Now, I had the sense to remove that battery when I first acquired the machine, but what I did after that was I replaced the battery with really a cheaper alternative. What I did was I took a 6 AA cell battery holder, which I'll show you here, and put 3 alkaline batteries in it to give you a total of 4.5 volts, and I wired that in. Now I had stuck that to the top of the graphics chip, just using blue tack to hold it in place. Of course, what I had forgotten was even these alkaline batteries can corrode, and as you can see, the bottom of these batteries have corroded quite badly. And as a result, it has also corroded the pins on the chip that it was sitting on. So I have no idea if this board will still work, but we shall find out in the next video, hopefully. But let's just hope it's still good. I do have another machine. I have another machine like this, in fact, which I can always take the board out of. But it's just a shame that I had forgotten about the battery in this one. So, oops. Again, let that be a lesson to everyone who has old Macs. Even if you replace the battery with a new one, if you lived in there long enough, it will corrode. So, lesson learnt on that one. So moving on from there, we've got the, now, what does that say? GIMO? Is that what it says? GIMO? Yes. No idea what that's for. Maybe someone can help me with that. Video DIMM. This is where the video RAM is installed. It's installed on a small DIMM module that looks like this. So that, I believe, is a 2 megabyte module that has the video RAM on it, which you can expand up to 4 megabytes, I believe. Another glue logic chip there from Texas Instruments. And here's the main CPU under a passive heatsink, which is certainly impossible these days. So this one is the 200 MHz PowerPC 603E CPU. And in fact, what I might do is I might just quickly take off the heatsink and clean up the CPU so you actually see what it looks like. So I'll be back in just a moment. Okay, we're back. And I've now taken the heatsink off the CPU, so that's the actual CPU there. The PowerPC 603E running at 200 megahertz. And I think that's probably about all. Oh, speaker connector over there. But I believe that's about all there is to see on the logic board. All right, so that's the logic board out of the Power Macintosh 7220. So now we'll have a look at the hard disk. Okay, here is the hard disk out of the Power Macintosh 7220. But I do believe this is not the original drive, mainly because it's too small. The 7220/200 would normally come with a 2 GB disk. This one's only a 540 meg. And if I remember, they normally came with Quantum hard disks, not IBM's. Because I think my other 7220 has a Quantum Fireball ATA disk in it. But anyhow, this is the one that we've got, so we'll have a look at it. So it's an IBM DALA 3540. So I believe that's 3 platters for 540 megabytes of unformatted capacity. You see capacity 540 meg and 527 meg formatted. But the date's about right, built in March of 1995. Made for IBM Corp, made in Thailand. And so that's the front of the disk. So let's flip it over and look at the back where the controller is. And as you can see, a very well integrated controller. It takes up less than half of the area of the drive. So not much to really see. You've got the connector there for the head mechanism, connector there for the spindle motor. That's probably the driver IC there for the motor, and a couple of controller ICs. There's the jumpers for setting master-slave, I presume, and that's about it. So very well integrated drive. Right, well, that's the hard disk. So now we'll have a quick look at the floppy drive. Okay, here is the floppy drive out of the Power Macintosh 7220. And really, for all intents and purposes, it's nothing more than a standard PC mechanism. Probably the only difference would be the controller that allows it to use GCR encoding rather than MFM. But as you can see, it's a standard mechanism made by Mitsubishi, made in Thailand, MF355F. And of course, compared to the earlier floppy drives Apple used that had auto-inject, this one has a manual inject. And as a result, the mechanism is very much simpler than the older drives, because, as I've mentioned, you have to insert the disk all the way in before it will actually load. And just like that. So, as you can see, it's a very simple and cheap mechanism, but not much else to really see there. All you can see from that's the front there. You can see from the back, we've got the head motor there and the connector, and that's really about it. So what we'll do now is we'll have a look at the CD-ROM. Okay, here is the CD-ROM out of the Power Macintosh 7220, and like other models around at the time, it's a 8-speed ATAPI drive, manufactured February of 1997, the Apple CD8X, which is really a rebadged Panasonic, even though it doesn't say so anywhere on here. Class 1 laser product issue, does it say? Oh, there we go. Matsushita Electronics Industries, there we go. So it's a rebadged Panasonic CR583B. Again, pretty much exactly the same component that was probably used in hundreds of thousands of DOS and Windows PCs at the time. Again, the front panel is exactly the same. And notice in this case, Apple didn't even bother to remove the activity LED headphone jack and volume control. Even though they were obscured by the front panel, Apple didn't actually bother to modify it to take them out. It was obviously cheaper just to use exactly the same unit that was being produced by the thousands. And eject button there, and manual eject hole. Yeah, tray loading. Nothing special there. And from the back, again, standard ATA CD-ROM. So, yeah, power supply connector, IDE interface there, and all the stuff. Focus. And standard jumper settings there, master slave cable select, and analog audio, and actually digital out, which is unusual for one of these. Okay. So that's about it. So that really concludes our look at the Power Macintosh 7220. So in part 2, as usual, once I reassemble the 7220, assuming it works, of course, I'll power it up and show a couple of old Macintosh games. So, hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for part 2.